Welcome students to lesson 4 of the Urban World topic. In this lesson we begin our case study of a city in a NEE, Rio de Janeiro. I'm going to introduce the city of Rio today and explain to you why it's famous, and moving forwards we'll be looking about the good things and the bad things, so the opportunities and the challenges of life in a NEE city. Please write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Okay, time to review prior learning. Please write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory, and then mark your answers. Game time. 1. Human population growth, which accelerated in the 20th century, was partly due to the discovery of modern medicines. 2. Urbanization is the increasing percent of people living in urban areas. 3. A megacity is a city with more than 10 million people. 4. The highest percent of people live in cities in HICs. 5. Increasing urban populations are caused by migration and natural increase. 6. In what biome is desertification the biggest problem? It's the semi-arid or savanna grassland biome. 7. What is the region of Africa in which most countries suffer from desertification? It is the Sahel. 8. Climate change is accelerating desertification because it is leading to reduced precipitation in many parts of the world. 9. Eutrophication is the excess of nutrients in a water body, which causes algal blooms that kill plants, leading to a loss of oxygen. 10. The multiplier effect describes how one economic activity leads to many others. For example, building a factory or a car factory in a country leads to tyre companies, wiring companies, transport companies setting up to supply that company. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or more, awesome work. Any that you got wrong, write the questions and their answers and then test yourselves on them in a week's time. To introduce the city of Rio de Janeiro, which I'm going to do this lesson, I'm going to show you some photos about it, and then I'm going to show you some questions. Try and answer the questions using the photos. So here are the photos. All of Rio de Janeiro. Try and answer the questions. Number 1. What sectors seem to be important in Rio de Janeiro from looking at these photos? Well, you may have looked at this and said that tourism might be important. Tourism is in the tertiary sector, it's a service. For example, owning a beach and providing drinks and food to people, or surfing lessons, service. You may have also said the secondary sector is important, construction. You may have also said the secondary sector is important based on this, manufacturing. These are the key sectors that you would have noticed are important in Rio de Janeiro. 2. Why might someone visit Rio? Well, Rio is famous because of its tourism, but what is it that's attracting people there? Well, if you look at this photo here, you'll see immediately the key feature of Rio that attracts people. It's the beaches. 2 of the most famous beaches in the world, the Copacabana beach and the Ipanema beach, are in Rio de Janeiro. Also, in 2014 and 2016, major sports events, the World Cup and the Olympics, were held in Rio. For example, in this stadium, the Maracanã, one of the biggest football stadiums in the world. Every single year in Rio de Janeiro, there's the Rio Carnival, the biggest street party in the world. Is there any evidence of inequality? Well, yes, you should have said that in this photo you can tell that some people are clearly poor. These houses look quite derelict, which means run down. You may have said that these areas here, these buildings are quite cramped and crowded. They don't look particularly affluent or rich. You may have said that this area here with the Maracanã, the big stadium, has some poor areas above it, but more affluent areas here. Richer areas. What environmental problems can you see in this photo? You may have talked about the waste that you can see building up in the streets here. You may have also talked about the air pollution that might come from the cars and the other vehicles that drive through the streets. These are key environmental issues caused by cities. So in this topic I'm going to be telling you more about these photos, about the good things about Rio, how people make money, why their lives are good, why it's famous, and I'm also going to be telling you about the bad things, such as inequality and crime and environmental problems. and I'm going to help you understand what Rio de Janeiro is doing to solve those problems to make life better for its people. Okay, let's start. First of all, this is a geography lesson, so we need to know the where. Where is Rio de Janeiro? Okay, here is a map of South America. And in South America you have Brazil, the largest country in South America by population and area. Brazil borders almost every country in South America with the exception of Ecuador here and Chile. It's one of South America's richest countries, and it's famous for the Amazon rainforest in the north. The northern part of Brazil goes through the equator. It has a tropical rainforest climate. That's why the rainforest is here, the Amazon. The southern part of Brazil goes through the Tropic of Capricorn, much drier climate. Rio de Janeiro is located in the southeast of Brazil, here on the coastline. And, importantly, it is one of 3 cities that make up Brazil's economic centre, so where most of Brazil's money is made, where most of the biggest companies have their headquarters, and where most of the richest people live. Rio de Janeiro is one of those 3. What are the other 2? You have the capital city, Brasilia, and you have Brazil's largest city and richest overall, Sao Paulo. These form what is called the industrial triangle, like this, in Brazil. It's the area of Brazil where most manufacturing happens, where most of the highest paid jobs are. In Brazil there is very high inequality, and most of the richest people and most of the richest cities are on the coast. For example, Curitiba down here, Sao Paulo and Rio are all on the coast in the south. Inland in Brazil, people tend to be much poorer, and that's been the case in the past as well. Brazil used to be a colony of Portugal, and Portugal used it to export commodities, natural raw materials, but they only really settled and invested in the ports. So, in 1960, the Brazilian government decided to move the capital city, which was in Rio de Janeiro, to Brasilia, a brand new city that they built from scratch in the centre of Brazil. If you ever look at Brasilia from a map or through photos, you'll see that the roads are all very neatly organised, the buildings are all pre-planned, there are sewers everywhere, everything seems to be perfectly planned, and that's exactly what happened. Before the people moved in, the city was built. Brasilia was built to try to reduce inequality in Brazil between the coast and inland. By having Brasilia as the capital city, it was hoped that many big businesses would move there, creating jobs for people and raising their incomes. As it happens, Brasilia is now one of the richest, most developed cities in Brazil. It has one of the highest HDI scores, Human Development Index, and one of the highest GDP per capita scores. So it's quite effective. But here is Rio de Janeiro's location within Brazil. In the northeast of Brazil, here you have a drier climate. In the south, you have a drier climate as well. Northwest, you have the Amazon tropical climate. And in Rio de Janeiro, it's in the middle. It's neither too dry nor too wet. It's a coastal maritime climate, which means the temperature range doesn't change too much throughout the year. And it gets regular rainfall because of precipitation that comes from evaporated ocean water forming clouds and rain. So that's where Rio is. What are the main areas of Rio de Janeiro? Let's zoom in on the city itself. This is a zoomed in version of the map of Rio de Janeiro pointing here. So what do you see? Some key features that we need to know about. First things first. This highlighted red area forms what is known as the old part of Rio de Janeiro. Rio de Janeiro was created by the Portuguese when they had an empire, and Portugal turned Brazil, current Brazil, into a colony, and they used it to extract the raw materials such as gold and silver from underground in Brazil, and they supplied slaves from Africa and African countries to Brazil to be able to work in the mines and on the land. Rio de Janeiro was created to be a major port. It originally formed here, in the centre, and that port was used to load up ships with the raw materials, the commodities, found inland in Brazil, and then they were transported across the Atlantic Ocean back to Portugal, where they were sold around Europe, and the Portuguese business people became very rich. This is the old city. And in 1811, this was the map of Brazil. Brazil gained its independence from Portugal around this time and became a real country. This process is called colonialism, where one country invades and controls another. If you're not sure about that process, then go back to the development topic and watch the lesson on it. There is Rio de Janeiro in the southeast, and here's what happened. Because Rio was a port, as it was used to transport commodities, such as these in this photo, from South America to Europe. However, over time, and after Brazil's independence, Rio de Janeiro began to grow. And so you have now got this blue area which forms the new city of Rio de Janeiro, and it's very different. For this happened because of migration from inland and from European countries and other countries around the world after 1900, mostly in Brazil. People moved to Rio de Janeiro from inland in Brazil to seek better jobs in the port city, better jobs certainly than they were inland, and they moved from around the world to come to this new independent country which was doing very well, Brazil. Migration. Additionally, this migration to Rio de Janeiro led to massive population growth. Consequently, many more houses were needed and much more land was needed, and so the old city spread northwards and spread westwards to form all of this new area of the city, which I will explore further with you in a second. A couple more key features you need to know about. The red area of Rio, the old city, is the richest part, much richer than the blue area, the north, generally. In the centre here, you'll notice there's no settlement. Very few buildings are built. This is a mountainous area in the centre of Rio called Tijuca, spelt like this, Tijuca, National Park. And here, atop a mountain called Corcovado Mountain, is the Christ the Redeemer statue, which you may have seen. Christ stands with his arms stretched out wide, overlooking Rio. Consequently, buildings cannot be constructed here, so they have to spread out west and north of it. But that's the story of Rio de Janeiro's structure, where the old part and the new parts are. So let's look at each of these areas specifically and find out what it's like in each of them. You'll remember that the famous beaches in Rio, Copacabana and Ipanema, they're on the southern area, in what's called the south zone of Rio. And Barra da Tijuca, the richest neighbourhood in Rio, also located along the coast. These beaches are famous worldwide, and they attract thousands of tourists every year. But additionally, it's where many of the wealthiest people in Brazil and in Rio de Janeiro live. Modern apartment blocks are built all along the beaches, where Brazil's young, educated people who have jobs in expensive office buildings here in the centre live. This is known as the beachfront part of the city. The oldest part of Rio is the Centro, the central zone. It's where you have some of the really old museums, like this. This is the original palace of Rio. And you can see lots of gold architecture here. Much of these materials and designs come from 150 years ago when Portugal had an empire and built these palaces. And behind you see the tall skyscrapers. Those are the office blocks of some of Brazil's biggest companies, TNCs. However, let's look at the new city. It's very different. All these yellow spots have emerged in Rio de Janeiro because of migration of poor rural workers in Brazil and other countries in South America who have come seeking jobs and a better life. However, because of a lack of space, and because the government couldn't invest fast enough to build houses for all these new people, these people had to construct poorly built homes like these out of concrete and bricks and wood and tin and whatever they could find. And so you have these large communities densely packed with small houses dotting up around Rio, mostly in the north, but also, for example here, a place called Rocinha here, and some located in the west, and some located even in the richest parts in the south, here and here and here. These areas of Rio and Brazil are called favelas. They're the poorest areas of cities, and they are illegally built. The people do not have a right to live there, and their homes could, in theory, be demolished at any time by the government who wish to build a factory or an apartment block. However, some new migrants to Rio de Janeiro do live in more modern areas, and in the last 40 years, more modern communities, such as this here in Rio, have been built in the new city. Meaning that not all of the new city is very poor. It looks architecturally very different. For instance, these buildings look very different to this palace here. And they are generally residential areas, which means it's where people live, not where people work. Most people work, and most of the big companies are in the red old city. And finally, you'll notice the purple areas. What are they? When Brazil was a colony of Portugal, it was mostly used for the exploitation of raw materials, the primary sector, mining and farming. As Brazil has developed, the government has invested in the secondary sector, manufacturing. Since most manufacturing happens in cities and on the coast to make for easy trade around the world, Rio de Janeiro has lots of new industrial manufacturing areas. They are these purple areas. Here, the secondary sector. This is the Land Rover factory, the largest Land Rover factory in Brazil, and it's located in Rio de Janeiro. And because factories need a lot of space, and because land around here is cheaper to be able to build on, most industrial areas in Rio are in the new city, especially the north. Car ownership, health, education, size and quality of housing, generally the best in the old city. Tertiary sector jobs and formal economy with high-paid jobs, and mostly in the old city. If you ever have looked at the Brazilian football team, you'll notice that they look different. Some of them are darker skinned than others. Why is that? Because Portuguese slave workers transported slaves from African countries and used them to work in Brazil. When Brazil became independent, these former slaves ended up becoming part of the normal population and working, and they looked different to the European migrants that were the colonizers from Portugal, and the new European migrants from, for example, Germany to Brazil. Consequently, Brazil's demographics, their people, are very diverse. You have white and black in the same communities. In the new city, there is a higher proportion of darker skinned people, and in the old city, a higher proportion of lighter skinned people from Europe. Time to assess learning. Question 1. Why do you think most of Rio's favelas are located in the north? The main reason is that population growth meant that new houses were needing to be built. However, the old city was already established on the coast, and so the only place to build was in the north or on the hills. For example, Rocinha, just south of Tijuca National Park, is on a hill. Question 2. What's the advantage for Rio de Janeiro of being on the coast? Well, you should have said that being on the coast allows easier trade through the port of Rio de Janeiro. When Brazil manufactures goods and transports them around the world, much of this goes through Rio's port. This makes it easier to export to, for example, North America or Europe, and import from those places as well. Question 3. Why do many of the buildings in the centre of Rio look quite old? And why do they look quite grand? Well, you should have said that many of the buildings in the centre were built by the colonizers of the Portuguese Empire, who became extremely wealthy after trading goods and commodities like gold and silver. And they built these constructions, such as these palaces and museums, to show how wealthy they were. This was also the style of the time. And finally, why do you think most European migrants live in the neighbourhoods like Barra da Tijuca in the south of Rio and the west of Rio. You should have said that most European migrants to Brazil are educated and young, and consequently they demand higher paid jobs and they have higher incomes when they migrate to Brazil. Consequently, they can afford to live in more affluent, rich neighbourhoods like Barra da Tijuca. And far fewer European migrants live in the new city, especially in the favelas. Time to embed learning. I'm going to show you some questions. Answer them using your understanding this lesson, and then mark your answers. So question 1, why was Brazil's capital city moved? Make sure you have both points. 2, explain how Rio's location within Brazil has given it economic importance both in the past and today. So 2 marks for past, 2 marks for today. 3, describe and explain, so you need to say why, Rio's favelas are located where they are, the distribution. Key points. They're mostly located on the hilly mountainsides and the northern parts. It was originally a coastal port city, so the old town occupies the flat land by the sea. And then talk about rapid population growth. Make sure you add any corrections or missing parts from that question. And 4, which area of Rio has the highest rate of car ownership, and give a reason. It's Barra da Tijuca, and then any one of these reasons is acceptable. Give yourselves a mark out of 12. If you got 10 or more, excellent. Make sure you add any corrections in green pen. That's vitally important. From the lesson, write 2 questions. Answer them from memory now, and then test yourselves on these questions in a week's time. Excellent. Next lesson, we're going to be looking at why Rio de Janeiro is important and why its economy is so successful, why so much money is made there. Join me then.